Welcome everyone to the launch webinar of the Textile Recycling Breakthrough Report. I'm going to take you through the agenda for the session today. My name is Clara Luckner. I'm a director and the fashion lead at Systemiq in London. And first we're going to hear some opening remarks from Kate Goldsworthy, professor at the University of the Arts London and chair of our steering group for this project. We, Systemiq, are then going to do a brief presentation of the study findings, and we'll have a half-hour panel moderated by Sophie Herman, partner at Systemiq, before we conclude with a 10-minute audience Q&A. However, do feel free to post questions in the Q&A throughout the session. We're then going to curate a couple of questions to put forward to the panel. So, Kate, over to you.
Thank you so much, Clara. I'm really thrilled to welcome you to this event on behalf of the team at Systemiq. As Clara mentioned, I had the honour of acting as chair on the independent steering group, and I'm so happy to see this final outcome report launched today. Without spoiling too much of the content that's about to be presented, the Textile Recycling Breakthrough is a multi-stakeholder study led by Systemiq, providing the first tipping point analysis on textile-to-textile polyester recycling. It draws on economic modelling, systems analysis, real financial data, as well as insights from 17 organisations across the value chain, including brands, recyclers, civil society, and infrastructure. The study identified 10 key levers to unlock exponential growth in polyester recycling in Europe. It quantifies the cost gap between chemically recycled and virgin polyester, outlines policy and investment solutions, and shows how Europe can scale depolymerization nearly tenfold by 2035. I think that's just incredible. The study was funded by grants from Arc'teryx, Eastman, Interzero, Textile Exchange, and TOMRA, and the steering group was built to represent industry across the value chain, as well as ensuring independence and rigor. And just from a personal perspective, it's been over 20 years since the first commercial fibre-to-fibre chemical recycling process was launched in Japan with Teijin's EcoCircle. I'm sure many of you remember. And I really thought back then that that was it, that this was the tipping point that was needed, but sadly not. Although the technology was proved at that point, or certainly an aspect of it, as we now know, there have been so many challenges to overcome since then. I think what's incredible about this study is that although it's focused on depolymerization, actually a lot of the logic and the actions apply to a whole range of recycling technologies that are starting to get close to market and commercialize. I think the progress in design for circularity, certainly over the last 5 years, has been incredible, with really close cooperation from recyclers to understand their sort of real actions and real specifications. I think our understanding of LCA and full sustainability criteria in the circularity space is getting better and better, and that includes not only energy and carbon and the effects on ecology, but also the social impacts that go hand in hand. And last, but of course not least, the system and connections that really need to be strong to make the wheels turn. And I think the recommendations in this report tackle all these and more, and I believe offer a much clearer route out of our current pilot purgatory. I think it's a great description that we really need to get circularity fully scaled. So with that, I'm really looking forward to the presentations and conversations in this next hour.
Thank you so much, Kate, both for the opening remarks and for chairing the steering group of this project. Me and my colleague Leonard are now going to take you through the study findings. So the main motivation for launching this project had been the frustratingly, as Kate just put it, slow uptake of textile-to-textile recycling over the many years, despite the frequent and promising announcements of innovator funding rounds, demonstration projects, and technology partnerships. So we asked ourselves, what would it take to break free of this incremental growth pattern to see a real shift in adoption? The uptake of new technology typically follows an S-curve. History suggests that once a positive tipping point is reached, exponential uptake of the new technology will commence. Take cars, for example. In the US, just 4,000 cars were sold in 1900. But then 10 years later, it was about 400,000 cars in that year. So a tipping point had clearly been reached in the meantime. Systemiq, in collaboration with the University of Exeter, has developed a proven methodology to accelerate positive tipping points in clean technologies. A positive tipping point occurs when a clean technology meets three conditions. It's more affordable, more attractive, and more accessible than a conventional alternative. And accelerating the scale-up of clean technologies leads to lower environmental impact and earlier economic benefits for companies and regions. So for this analysis, as Kate just explained, we decided to focus on textile-to-textile recycling of post-consumer polyester waste in Europe. Depolymerization methods, which includes a number of technologies, are a promising technological route for recycling large proportions of Europe's growing volumes of polyester textile waste back into polyester fiber, so back into the same application or product, when reuse or mechanical recycling are not viable. These depolymerization technologies are both environmentally attractive and technically capable of producing virgin equivalent outputs, which is really key here. However, our assessment of the status quo, which you see here on the left across the three conditions I just named for creating a tipping point, revealed that there exist massive or really considerable barriers around accessibility and affordability when we compare depolymerization to virgin polyester in Asia, where most of the polyester production for the textiles industry is located today. On the affordability side, following this process to make recycled polyester is estimated to cost about 2.6 times more than to produce virgin polyester, which was shown here on the right. This is already considering commercial scale facilities, including automated sorting processes. Accessibility challenges exist on both supply and demand side. On the supply side, access to textile waste feedstock at the necessary quality and quantity for at-scale recycling remains out of sight. On the demand side, the current price premium we just showed means that most brands continue to favor cheaper virgin polyester or recycled polyester from PET beverage bottles, while the production value chain has little incentive to incorporate this material on its own accord, in the absence of policy or other mechanisms. So without targeted policy and industry action to address both affordability and accessibility barriers, depolymerization will remain stuck in pilot purgatory, and the breakthrough to mass adoption will not happen. So why do we care about this in the first place? What's the matter with recycling textile waste? It matters because the global textile system remains extremely linear, and the waste crisis is worsening as volumes grow and quality declines. Each year, over 125 million tons of raw material are consumed by the global textiles industry, yet less than 1% are made from recycled textile waste. Most textile waste is landfilled, incinerated, or exported, often to regions lacking the infrastructure to manage it responsibly, which results in significant negative environmental and social impacts. I'm sure you've all seen pictures from Atacama Desert in Chile, for example, such as the picture on the right, where you see blatantly obvious macroplastic leakage or macrotextile leakage into the environment. Meanwhile, the share of textiles for reuse is declining, driven by ultra-fast fashion and the rise of low-cost, low-durability garments. Without a functioning recycling system, the linear status quo will continue to deepen Europe's and the world's textile waste crisis. However, if we look at the volumes today, less than 1%, and this is what we're showing here on the left, of post-consumer textile waste feedstocks is actually available for depolymerization. The majority of the textile waste is either going straight into household waste, is exported even if it can't be all resold, or disposed of in the process. So Leonard will now show you how we can change that.
Thanks, Laura. And in light of this problem we've just heard about, we now assessed what would be needed to overcome the barriers to a breakthrough in textile-to-textile depolymerization. So, Clara, if you switch to the next slide, we've identified 4 essential areas of intervention. The first one, in essence, is that recyclers need better access to quality feedstock. So with separate collection of textiles now mandated across the EU, it's especially important to ensure that this feedstock actually reaches reuse and recycling instead of these linear pathways that we're seeing so far. The second point is around then strengthening the offtake demand. So both brands and policymakers have a role to play to send reliable signals that recycled polyester will be used at scale. And this will then enable sorters and recyclers to invest with confidence. But while these sort of first 2 areas address the key accessibility areas that Clara mentioned, to address the affordability constraint, we then need 2 additional interventions. And the first of those is point 3 here, which is to reduce costs, in essence, by lowering energy costs and costs of capital to make sorting and recycling in Europe more attractive, as opposed to the disposal of or export of waste. And then lastly, even if we have sort of more feedstock and stronger demand and reduced costs in Europe, we'll still need to cover a remaining cost gap to make recycled polyester price competitive with virgin alternatives. So in essence, all 4 of these pillars are really important, and then together they can lay the foundation for a viable and competitive recycling industry that can really scale. But now let's look more closely at the levers that sit within each of these 4 pillars. So if we look at the wheel of levers here on the left, on the feedstock axis, which is the sort of light green part, we identified 4 priority levers to divert waste from export and disposal. The first one, and quite famous one, is implementing design for recycling. So by eliminating the sort of complex fiber blends and coatings and all the contaminating additives which we see in textiles today, or at least partly doing so, we can make garments significantly easier to sort and recycle, and then improve the yield and volumes that end up reaching recycled polyester outputs. Then secondly, we need to establish widespread separate collection. And as mentioned, there's a mandate since this year, which is a great start to this. But now collection needs to be scaled and done so in a harmonized way. And we think that bring points and civic amenity sites paired with public awareness will be able to achieve this. And the third lever is to set standards for sorting for recycling. And this is about defining feedstock quality specs, for example, when polyester is above 70% purity in a batch. And also to clarify on the roles within this value chain, both of which would then improve the throughput and operational efficiency. And the last lever in this first category of feedstock is to clarify trade and end of waste rules. And here we propose to define end of waste for textiles such that only sorted reusables or recycled outputs are traded. And this would then, in essence, keep the remaining feedstock in the system to be treated in Europe. Now, on the sort of demand side, we match these supply side levers through firstly a sort of policy incentive, and this is in essence the recycled content mandate, which is essential to guarantee a sort of predictable market signal. And then secondly, to create demand through ensured brand and supply chain commitments. And we find that to successfully manage the supply chain integration, an active involvement on behalf of the brands is important, particularly during this sort of early scale-up phase. And this is best achieved by sort of backing commitments with concrete budgets and sourcing targets and long-term supplier engagement. And then to reduce costs directly, 2 additional levers are proposed. So firstly, we would want to reduce EU energy prices, as these are notoriously high in international comparison. And if we can achieve a shift through tax reliefs and lower grid fees, this would certainly help the business case for recycling in Europe. And then secondly, we want to de-risk investments because the sort of high risk perception around textile sorting and depolymerization keeps the cost of capital elevated and also prevents a sort of well-functioning business case. And here, blended finance and long-term contracts can bring the cost of capital down, especially in the absence of an EPR fee. And then finally, we need two levers to level the remaining cost gap. First and foremost, an EPR fee. And this EPR fee is really the linchpin of the set of 10 levers, because if well designed, it can cover the net costs of collection, sorting, and recycling, and therefore then really make textile-to-textile recycling price competitive with virgin feedstock. And then this list of levers is just complemented by a final lever of a modest green premium, which is required to internalize shipping costs needed to transport recycled polyester to yarn producers in Asia, which wouldn't be covered by EPR fees, given that the majority of the yarn production value chain is located in Asia. So these levers could increase EU polyester depolymerization output nearly tenfold, as seen on the chart to the right and already mentioned by Kate, up to about 340,000 tons by 2035. And while this would still only meet about 15% of Europe's projected polyester demand in that year, it does mark a breakthrough and a sort of shift from this pilot scale to a functioning, scalable recycling system. So if we move to the next slide, let's look at the cost side of this equation. So while the sort of scale-up scenario that we just saw on the flow chart can be unlocked with feedstock accessibility and demand accessibility, an unresolved cost gap can remain a critical threat in the scale-up because, in essence, it could reduce brand uptake to the bare minimum needed for recycled content compliance, and it could also shift away investment from Europe towards cheaper, less regulated markets. So as a result, we modeled the expected cost impacts of the levers without the EPR fee, and then determined the required EPR fee to fully cover the remaining cost gap. And in this exercise, we basically learned several things. The first is that the scale-up itself isn't enough to bridge the cost gap. So scaling recycling volumes could close the cost gap by about 25%. So this is the turquoise slide you see quite far to the left, through economies of scale as plants grow larger and learning effects over time. But this is clearly not enough. And then reducing electricity costs and de-risking investments can sort of create an additional 15% reduction in the cost gap, which you see in the light blue. But this still leaves 60% of the cost gap intact. And as a result of this, our finding is that the EPR scheme is really, really essential to make the business case work. And we calculated an approximate fee of 330 euros per ton in 2035 as necessary to level this remaining cost gap. And while this figure is sort of an average across the EU and sort of directional nature, it does indicate that proposals like we saw in the Netherlands ranging between 120 and 220 euros per ton wouldn't be sufficient. So then if we have the EPR fee, because it likely won't cover the shipping expenses I mentioned earlier, this would then translate into the green premium, but this is fairly moderate at 55 euros per ton, but would become necessary at least once EU offtake for recycled polyester is exhausted and recyclers want to explore this sort of very significant Asian market. And another thing that's quite interesting to note is because put together the EPR fee and green premium would, create costs, of course, but it would indeed actually only increase costs by 15 cents for a 400-gram jumper, and I think this is quite a modest price, given that it could enable a circular textile in Europe finally. So with that said, back to you, Clara.
Thank you so much, Leonard. To wrap up this presentation, we wanted to end with a call to action. 2035 might seem a long time away, but we really need to start to see action right now. We've mapped the 10 levers against stakeholder groups and the degree to which we think they call for collective action. We've also in the report included some initiatives that are already active across these levers. We've chosen here, however, to highlight 3 specific actions that we believe are ripe for further dialogue right now and practical next steps. 1, supporting ambitious policy development with advocacy. 2, collaborating on infrastructure scaling ahead of EPR implementation. And 3, establishing bankable demand signals. Now, a few of the steering group members will share their perspective on this on the panel. If, however, you're interested in joining the dialogue on any of these actions, please get in touch with us after the webinar. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sophie, who will moderate the panel for us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Clara and Leo, for giving us a first overview of the study that we wrote. And yeah, a welcome to everyone again, also who joined in the meantime. We have more than 260 participants, so thanks a lot for your interest. And welcome to the panel discussion. Just a quick reminder for those that joined later, we do have a Q&A chat, so please, while the panel discusses, feel free to, 1, put your questions into the chat, and then secondly, also you can upvote questions, yeah, because we will take a bit of time for your questions after the panel discussion. So with that, yes, I'm Sophie Herman. I'm a partner with Systemiq, and with Clara and Leo from Systemiq side led this work. And just want to say it was really a dream project for us. 1, because we are very passionate about solving sustainability in the textiles industry. And second, also because this project or study is really something that Systemiq was founded to do. And that is really to take a systems perspective on how to transform industries and how to take up new technologies in value chains, like the textile value chain. And we like to not only describe the environmental impact that such a transformation would have, but in specific also address how to economically make such a transition viable and reach tipping points, as Clara explained in the very beginning. So I think that's one part of why that is a dream project for us, taking that systems perspective. But secondly, also because we had the chance to work with a consortium that represented the textiles value chain, that included academia, included also the civil society. So really a multi-stakeholder setup. And yeah, really want to thank everybody who was involved in that, in sharing perspectives and most of all also sharing data to make this a real live view on the topic of textiles recycling and the opportunity in Europe. And we see that a breakthrough can be reached. And I want to discuss this today with a few members of the steering committee and of our consortium. And so with that, I'm very happy to introduce the panelists today. First of all, we have Julia Haas with us, who is the head of commercial partnerships at Interzero. Interzero is an organization that on the one hand is a PRO, but on the other hand also does collection and sorting. So really an integrated organization, very relevant to building this EPR scheme in Europe. And that's exactly what Julia does. She works with brand partners on finding an industry solution for EPR in textiles. So great to have you and welcome, Julia. Then next we have Dr. Mauricio Crippa. And Mauricio, on the one hand, comes from academia. He has worked many years in organic and inorganic chemistry within academia, but then decided to actually found Green, or GR3N, you can also call it. And Green is focused on chemical recycling of polymers. And Mauricio is also the founder of the Association of Chemical Recycling in Europe. So really also a practitioner with a very rich view on the topic that we have with us today. So thanks for being with us, and welcome also Mauricio. And last but not least, I would like to welcome and introduce to you Priyanka Khanna. She is the Innovation Director for Scaling at Fashion for Good. And with that, she actually works with tech innovators on their commercialization journey. And she brings together to do that journey suppliers, brands, and the innovators. And I think with that also being able to already have that collaborative view, Priyanka can really share some unique perspective and experiences in building sustainable business cases in areas such as textile recycling. So thank you all for being with us today. And with this intro, I would like to start with a question to the three of you. So all of you, to basically, could you describe your unique perspective within your position in the value chain or in the system to say, what do you see as the biggest challenge in scaling textile recycling in Europe? And what do you see as the most important solutions that are needed in order to reach this breakthrough? Who would like to start? Julia, would you like to go first, maybe?
Yes, Sophie, thank you for sure. And before I jump into answering your question, maybe also from our side or InterZero's side, representing InterZero here, thanks to you, Sophie, Clara, Leo, and the whole Systemiq team for making this study work. I think it's a really, really nice sign, and very happy to be here today to talk about it. And also thanks to all the steering group members and everybody contributing, and also everybody listening today. Very nice to see where the discussion is heading towards too. So answering your question from the perspective of a PRO, but also from a sorter and collector's perspective, I could mention 100 things I'd say, which could be the barriers, but maybe focusing on one point that is also very much connected with the study is gaining security in investing in infrastructure, because we all know that the market is not there yet, and we now have the study and see what kind of levers have to work together in order to make it happen. But what's important from an infrastructure perspective is that there needs to be some investment, not only in recycling infrastructure, but also the infrastructure that comes before, in collection, in sorting. On the German market, there is some infrastructure on the market, but also that is shaking with the market movements now. In other markets, there's no infrastructure or nearly no infrastructure right now, and especially for providing the feedstock for textiles, there's no infrastructure in place. So that is really something that is currently a very big barrier, also coming from the lack of policy action on the one hand, of course, where we really need EPR to kind of get a feeling of or security where the market is moving towards to, since we don't know. It's a very new market on the one hand. And this part maybe also going hand in hand with very complex kind of partnerships that we need to build. So that is kind of the other perspective that we have. On the one hand, we need this investment with EPR, and on the other hand, we need long-term partnerships and commitments, not only with two parties, for example, sorters and recyclers, but also with more than two parties, since also recyclers need offtake agreements. And on the other hand, we need collectors that collaborate with sorters. So it's a very kind of complex long-term commitment along the whole value chain and partnerships that we need in place. And in the end, policy and security on that side and security on the partnership side, on the other hand, working together, which in the past was not as possible. And now we might see a shift. And last thing, wrapping this up, is there's a gap between EPRs coming in 2028, 2029 in Europe and today. So this action needs to happen now, as Clara also mentioned, and we kind of together with policymakers, but also with all the stakeholders I mentioned, need to build a ramp-up plan. What are we going to do within the next 3 years? How are we going to build investments? what will that look like? Because 2035, as we've seen in the study, is the one thing, but we also need investments now to happen. And that's definitely something that is very challenging, I'd say.
Thanks a lot, Julia. So I think, yes, some bigger collaborations than just a few or just a couple of value chain members. We did that, of course, in this study, so that was great. But putting it on the ground is obviously harder. So a ramp-up plan, I think, is a great thing. I think, yeah, from the practitioner side, Mauricio or Priyanka, who would like to go next on your view on the barriers and solutions? Yeah, Mauricio, please go ahead.
I was saying, Priyanka, please go ahead. But that's okay. I can echoing Julia strongly. First of all, thank you for organizing this webinar, and thank you for the amazing job you did on collecting information to produce the report. To all the team, was very well done. Answering your question is, I can echo Julia about the collaboration, but I will like to stress a little bit one point. The recycling of textile on polyester textile is a chemical plant. So it's completely different from a mechanical plant. Mechanical plant of polymers works with the polymer. A depolymerization recycling plant works with chemistry. So it's completely another domain, it's completely another cost. We are talking about investment of several hundred million euros for plant. So we are talking in a dimension that you have to convince investor to invest in this kind of technologies. So how you assure investments of this magnitude with the 20 years amortization time if you do not have a clear legislative framework? To me, is very, very important, because if you take, for example, the 10 levers that Leo described before, almost 7 and 8 on 10 are connected to legislative framework. This is really the ground base that the continent has to understand and take action in order to being attractive for investors to invest in this kind of complex plants. They do not live alone, of course, these plants, feedstock and products, but the rest, Julia, I think she really described very well about the collaborations.
Yeah, great, thanks. And I think that's also why it's called Why Policy Must Lead the Way. We definitely see how it influences the whole level playing field. Priyanka, please also go ahead with your views.
Thank you. And thank you for Systemiq and team to organize this. It is really hard to estimate data. We've been doing this for a really long time. We know it's not the easiest thing. So big frontier achieved here. I think we already mentioned feedstock, capital, commitments, policy. All of these are key challenges that need to be tackled. But maybe if I focus a bit more on feedstock, accessibility, quality, cost of feedstock, all of this needs to come together. And at times, we see recycled materials end up being 2 to 4 times. I mean, this report already gives you a figure. And one of the ways of bringing that cost down is really bringing the cost of feedstock down. That means we don't need just to create accessibility of feedstock. We need to make sure that the quality meets the requirements of the recyclers. And at the moment, where technologies are advancing, recycling technologies also have limitations of how much of this feedstock they can actually take in, which means that percentage of recycle that the diagram Clara showed, with reuse reducing constantly because of bad quality, there's now a larger chunk available for recycling, but yet, given the technological challenges, also only a smaller component will be able to use. So if you think about it, there is investments as well as R&D required across the supply chain in understanding how we can sort and pre-process better. So really, how do we make sure that the feedstock is very, very well primed for the recyclers? And when we started on this journey, I think 6 years back, the first frontier was we need to find collection of feedstock, we need to sort it, and we need to understand what the composition of feedstocks are, what this textile waste post-consumer is. And in 6 years, I can say that we've seen the growth of technologies like NIR scanning, like automated AI-based sorting, which are really, really now embedded in some of the sorters, which helps you understand what the composition of these materials, which means that was the first barrier passed already over the last 6 years in now understanding what the materials are that we are collecting. Because in most garments, you would say the labels are out, the brands somewhere or the other where you have the composition, they're not always readable. So that first barrier is almost passed, I would say. The second barrier is now that we know the composition, it's almost a grid to say X recycler can take X amount of this and X percentage of this. So how do we build that infrastructure where all of this is maximized so that we can go from that 0.5% to the 10% figure that was discovered? And I think that is where we need still a ton of R&D. Even though our technologies are maturing, are setting up new facilities, we still need a ton of R&D that needs to go in there and a ton of capital to go with it. Because R&D will help us figure out these new solutions, but capital will help us build that closed loop infrastructures that are required, both at country level, at continent level, then obviously the world over level. So I think that's just an additional point to what Maurizio and Julia already added.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks so much, Priyanka. Yeah, for adding that point of feedstock quality and quantity. And just to say, in the report, you would find for all the levers that were presented also great examples of where and how these levers have already been activated in the past. And I think also examples, obviously, of fashion for good work. So thanks a lot for pointing this out. Yeah, with that, I would like to go a bit into your individual areas and perspectives, starting with you, Julia and Interzero. So on the topic of collection and sorting, this is actually not a new industry. It's existed for decades, but we do see that there are actually strong economic headwinds at the moment. And I would like to get your perspective on how our consumption patterns might have changed and might be influencing this economic picture. So if you could say a few words about that, I think that would be very interesting for everyone to understand what's actually happening in the market here.
Yeah, for sure. And you're right, it's not a completely new market. It's existing specifically from a German perspective, but also from a European perspective. The collection of textiles is an existing market. When you look at the German market, you look at reports from the past, you can see that there's collection rates of 60%. So you feel like it might be quite good. But the problem is a bit that this, and I think most of the people from the textiles industry know that this infrastructure has been heavily relying on reuse and exporting and in the second-hand world, let's say. And this is heavily under pressure right now for several reasons. We all know the rise of fast fashion or ultra fast fashion or even real-time fashion, or however you want to call it, with Shein and Temu and other brands on the one hand, which is putting pressure on these systems since the quality is getting lower and lower of the material that is coming back in the system. And if the system heavily relies on economically reselling high quality material or higher quality material, this is obviously putting a lot of pressure on this part. And on the other hand, the high quality material is not completely gone. It's still there. We still have lots of material that it's bought from consumers, but we also learned that there's other ways of selling secondhand material. We have other platforms like Vinted or other peer-to-peer platforms, because we get value out of the material ourselves. So we don't put it in a collection system, or we don't put it in the collection bin on the streets anymore. We rather sell the good quality things, which is not a bad shift, right? It's a good shift, but it also puts pressure on the masses or the volumes that are coming back into the sorting system, which was relying on this part. And on the other hand, we also have market dynamics changing in the export countries, with also new quality materials or new material coming into these markets, making competition to secondhand materials. So the whole system, as it has been working in the past and it has been relying on the reuse market, is at a tipping point right now. So it doesn't really work this way anymore. And there needs to be some kind of way that it shifts, that we can use the material that is coming into that system. And I'm pretty sure that the consumption patterns, even though we all hope that we get more sustainable, won't change for the mass. So we do need a solution for this material and the low quality material coming back. So it really needs a shift right now because it has reached a point where it's not economically viable and working, sustaining itself anymore, which in the end brings recycling on the forefront again as one of the key elements that will definitely help to take all of that material that is coming through this part of the system. Yeah, so consumption patterns, I'd say, influence that part a lot during the last 20 years.
Interesting. No, thanks a lot, Julia, for giving such a comprehensive view of what is putting pressure on the textile system, and why recycling then as a response to less reuse is basically such an important also aspect to solve. And in this study, we looked particularly at polyester, which is the largest source of textile fiber worldwide. And looking at polyester, of course, one of the recycled inputs or the recycled content has been coming actually from PET bottles. And with, especially in Europe, with the legislation and minimum quota for recycled PET in bottles coming, there is quite a bit of pressure on that recycled content also for the textile market. And Priyanka, I would like to invite you to comment on that, and actually to see how could the textile sector use its own waste rather than recycled bottles. What do you see as the innovations that are actually needed in that space?
Great. I think if I think of it from a brand's lens, which is the textile industry, there is a lot of excitement about textile to textile recycling. There has been for a while. It's not just impact-wise probably much better. It's also makes a really good narrative in the consumer market. But the two big challenges as these technologies scale will be around quality. The quality of these fibers going to match what conventional and bottled fiber is providing, and then will the costs match up? Because no matter what we say, this is a very cost sensitive industry. The supply chain sits outside in Asia, in South America, in Africa, in more manufacturing countries where labor cost is cheaper, overall production cost is cheaper. So that already becomes a hindrance because there's so much cost sensitivity as one garment changes hands by around like, I don't know, 200, 300 people that touch one garment before you actually wear them. So I think those are some of the key challenges. I mean, I can quote from our work because earlier this year we launched an executive blueprint for scaling next-gen materials, recycled materials and beyond. And I think what we identified for the executives of the brands were that there are two types of levers that they need to work towards. One is individual levers. What can they do individually, whether it's setting strategy or it's driving demand? We kind of argued that the function is three-phase. Like they have to look at demand, they have to look at cost, how they can help drive the cost down, and then they have to look at capital, which means they also have to help signal to the industry to actually drive some of the capital in. That being said, it's not all that needs to be done. At an individual level, you can go as far. Collectively, you can go much further. And that's where the collective levers kind of come in place. And we feel that is probably one of the more essential things. The industry needs to come together in as many places as possible to make sure that we are able to drive collective demand, we are able to collectively bring the costs down and drive the capital collectively as well through our signals. Why this is also really important, because the way the industry is set up, there is a lot of sharing of supply chain. It's not one supplier producing for one brand. Most suppliers usually produce for multiple brands. Every brand works with hundreds of suppliers. So that complexity almost is only going to be solved if there is more collective action. But with respect to materials, some of the examples of, let's say, collective demand setting would be initiatives like Fiber Club, which was launched with Circ earlier this year. And that's really saying, how can we enable bring supply chain efficiencies and make sure more brands can access what is available so that they're able to commit to as larger volumes come forward. Similarly, another initiative that Fashion for Good and Canopy are driving is around how do we decouple premium pricing, and how do we make sure that if premiums are the challenge for adoption, if we can decouple premiums from the supply chain and maybe sort of take it from a separate bucket, have that further subsidized, we can actually drive faster offtake of these materials in the market. And then feedstock, I think, makes a very, very good collective action or collective action for the industry as well, because nobody individually can solve these feedstock challenges. Brands can attempt to do the take back, yes, but if the systems aren't in place, they can't really do that much. So collectively, brands have the power to, particularly in certain geographies, to drive the action forward with the policymakers, with the infrastructure guys, with the capital guys, also in feedstocks. So I think those are some of the key levers. In terms of innovations, which is, I think, part 2 of your questions, I think the recycled technologies are now starting to reach that point already. We project about, I think, 10, I don't remember the exact data now, but 10 million tons of capacity is coming by 2030. But really, the point of inflection is 28, where we see the first of facilities with large-scale volumes coming together. And that means all of this work needs to happen now, and recycling technologies are already now in a good place of trying to get that capital and trying to get the feedstock sorted and get there. But the next frontier for that, for us then, is also looking beyond recycling, which is where we look at other synthetic opportunities like biosynthetics to say, what is the next frontier as the recycling technology scale? How do we make sure we have newer, better feedstocks also coming in the market? But I believe all of those are much more in nascent stage and will probably be the next frontier to tackle after 2030.
Perfect. Yeah, and thanks for also pointing beyond recycling. We do not want to close the perspective on that, obviously, but I do want to go back for the purpose and the value of having Mauricio with us. You said large-scale facilities are coming on board. Actually, reaching that scaling of tenfold that we are describing in the report, it does require multi-million investments into chemical recycling. And I would like to hear from you, Mauricio, under which conditions do you think this can be achieved, particularly also in Europe? Because you have mentioned the price sensitivity, Priyanka, and of course there are global dynamics at play, also with post-industrial waste being recycled in Asia, for example. So Mauricio would be very grateful on your point of view on how to, under which conditions to achieve these investments, and what's the role of recycling in Europe within that system.
Oh, yeah. Well, let's take a picture about the situation from an industrial point of view. What we have a continent where we have the waste. The waste is in the continent. So what we produce with chemical recycling is a virgin-like polyester that can be used for multiple purposes. For spinning again to produce a new yarn or to do something else. It doesn't matter, it's a virgin-like polymer. So in Asia, we have the same situation. They have waste and they can process. But the point is that the textile and the fabrics in general are produced in Asia and shipped to Europe. So the waste is here. So do we want to ship the waste or we want to recycle the waste? The waste has a low value material, and we do what with this material? We do nothing unless we do not recycle. And in the moment we recycle, we increase the quality of the material because we produce virgin-like polymer. So in my perspective, there are no other options than doing recycling in Europe to process the waste and to increase the value of the material that can be shipped back to Asia for new spinning, or the possibility is that there is an insuring about the spinning, at least closer to Europe. For example, maybe I'm not saying maybe in Germany, but for example, in Italy, there are spinners, in Spain are spinners, in the east of Europe, in North Africa, there are spinners. So maybe it can be a new flux with a better environmental impact because the transportation is mitigated. It's a possibility. I try to do very short because we are running out of time. So
that's
we're
very
1
kind.
minute to the end of the panel.
No, and thanks very much also for bringing, like Priyanka, a bit looking beyond, what are solutions like nearshoring that really can play a role in solving this systems view. So thanks a lot to all of you. We are getting in a poll. Please, all the participants, I encourage you to participate on the poll. Will be very interesting from opportunity with such a big audience to actually get your perspectives. Thank you also for sending in questions. I would like to take this opportunity of the last 10 minutes to take up your questions from the audience. And for that, I would briefly switch over. We had one question that is asking, do you see recent announcement from Cirque to build a 500 million polycotton recycling facility as a sign that the tipping point is reached or close to being reached? Thanks a lot for this question. Priyanka, would you like to comment on that one? Are we already at a tipping point? How do you interpret this investment?
Yeah, super interesting announcement and great question. I think it's so relevant for today's webinar in general. I'm not sure if I would call it a tipping point, but I think it's an excellent example on what we really need. Like I think Julia mentioned in the beginning, we need collaboration and we need the believers to actually move this forward. So committed, like French government and the ecosystem has committed to something together with them in making this feasible. You would normally, it is considered that manufacturing at that large scale coming out of Europe is not where the ecosystem currently lives, because manufacturing lives in Asia and others. But given France being very ahead on the EPR journey, I think it is an excellent move to have a facility like that and a commitment like that coming here. So I think it is a very positive sign for textile to textile recycling in Europe. It's the first of the capacities. We know at least a couple more that in the next few years are coming. So it is, I would say, the positive signal both investors, industry, the feedstock market, and all the stakeholders need to make this work, to make this entire ecosystem work.
Oh, we make the same announcement the past year. Just don't want to be jealous. In Spain. With the support of the European Commission, this is another point I would like, because Priyanka raised the point that France is supporting this industry, but also at the European level, we got the Innovation Fund for this plant. So this is another very important aspect with the concrete support. Public investment to support the de-risking of building these kind of plants. It's a very good point.
Yeah.
Thank you. We had one more question that I would like to read out, which said most tipping point analyses for polyester recycling in Europe focus on monomaterial PET flows. What models are being developed to incorporate complex blended feedstocks like polycotton, a major barrier in India and Southeast Asia? Mauricio, would you also like to comment on that one? I think it's a very important one, because obviously
I'm gonna be very clear on this point. There is no monomaterial in textile industry. Forget it, because a trim of cotton, it's ruin an entire batch of mechanical recycling. That's why mechanical recycling. There was another question regarding mechanical recycling. Why mechanical recycling is not at scale when we talk about textile? For these reasons, because the textile needs a lot of chemicals inside. It's not negative, but if we want a function, my t-shirt is red, I want a red t-shirt. I don't want a colorless t-shirt. Simply that's that. There is an opacizer. There is everything on the fabric, on the yarn. So this is a really problematic for mechanical recycling. So for chemical recycling regarding polycotton, there are technologies that separate. We do, for example, there are other technologies they do in another position of the process of recycling. It depends on the technology. We can integrate with someone else. There are technology able to separate the cotton and the polyester. One of the issue I see is that the polyester fraction can be transferred to me. For example, I can valorize to produce virgin like. The question is the cotton, what we do with this cotton. But people do it. So why not? Why not? So I
Probably we
see the technologies around, many different technologies. So there are more than one winner.
Well, probably need to work in both directions. No,
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
we do point out in the report how design for recycling is key, and that there is a lot of simplification possible, but on the other hand, also develop technology to adjust to reality. One last question maybe we can take, and Julia, I would give this one to you because it's about a very diverse question, so thanks to the audience for that. The question is about the bottle and textile to textile recycling link, and it is asking, is there any mechanism or consideration to reverse the bottle to textile and now allow textile to bottle? Most PET bottles are produced and filled in Europe and already have recycled content targets and in need of high quality recycled feedstock. So yes, today the textile system is very much sucking from the, let's say, from the packaging system. Can we reverse that?
Yeah.
Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. For sure, might also be a question more targeted towards somebody who's an expert in the recycling. However, I feel like reversing it might, I mean, the ultimate goal is to always keep the closed loop, right? So ultimately, we keep bottle to bottle and textile to textile. That's where we are going to head towards to. However, from the textiles perspective, the roadmap for sure needs to look different also to make the whole system economically viable. We need some other outlets as well. That's what I talked about in the beginning on the ramp up side. And for sure also need to somehow use the packaging industry in order to just have a broader range of offtakes possible also from the recycler's perspective to in the end reach the textile to textile. Reversing it from what I know and my perspective and really use textile in the bottle industry might also depend a bit on the legislative side, since as far as I know that there needs to be food grade materials, so we need to reach that in some point during the process. And if that's possible, of course, it can also be used in this way around. And for sure, it should be, or we should have a look at how do we get to a ramp up and what kind of alternatives do we have? What kind of alternatives can we use along the way in order to, in the end, reach textile to textile recycling, but also give recyclers the chance to have other outlets in other industries and other markets.
Great. Thanks so much. I do want to take one last question, actually, which is looking a bit upstream. And I think this was also voted highly by the participants. And it relates to something you were also saying, and I invite any one of you to answer on it. It says, if fast fashion is leading to lower quality textile and lower reuse rates, shouldn't more be done upstream? So reduction of consumption and better quality textile. Any last quick thoughts as we close this meeting from any one of the panelists?
I'm happy to go first. This is one piece of work, right? Getting the feedstocks, getting the recycling. There are also lots of parallel efforts that are going on in understanding what needs to change in design. Maybe Kate's working on this as well, which is really design for circularity. How do we make sure that we are designing things that are lasting longer, but we also designing things that can be recycled? There are like in the design for circularity modules, there are discussions around material compositions as well. Particularly, how do we now get rid of materials that are very, very hard to recycle, that are actually much cheaper? But the ramification on the consumption market is quite high, because no matter what, it comes at a price point. If we are moving quality higher and higher, it also means the price points move. And I think that's where these conversations are ongoing in projects, and thinking is ongoing, but it's going to be a slower uptake, the same way as the rest of the industry changes, because no matter what, everything goes back to the price points that come to the market, and this is a sensitive market.
Thanks a lot, Priyanka. I will close here as we are reaching the hour, but it's just the end of the session. Yeah, I think also this consortium has shown that we can discuss together. We want to continue to doing so. So please do reach out for any further questions. We did see that there were quite a few questions on the calculation of the EPR fees and other costing of the or closing the cost gap through the levers. We will answer your questions. We think that is more on the Systemiq side because we did that modeling. So we will answer those separately, and do reach out with any questions anytime. So I think with that, a quick summary. I really want to thank you for that rich perspective to the panelists. The importance of that reuse had in financing the system and how that is shifting. I think that's because of our consumption patterns. I think that's a very important takeaway for me. But then also, Priyanka and Mauricio, as you were saying, the role one of policy in order now to make that system as it is shifting work, and then the role of collective action and of coming together. So examples like the Fibers Club, but also nearshoring, there is a lot of space there and a lot of need for collective action to make this the system work. So thanks to the panelists, I think, for that very let's say real practitioner's view and perspective on this piece of work, but also thanks to all the SteerCo members, obviously, that have helped in coming to this moment and this launch today. And finally, to everybody in the audience, and once again for the great questions that you also allowed us to discuss here today. So with that, closing here, and wishing everybody a great rest of the day, afternoon, wherever you are. And thanks a lot. Bye-bye.